Welcome, and thank you for joining us for another online program from the Adams County Historical Society. My name is Antigone Ladd, and I serve here on the Board of Trustees, and I'm really pleased to be your host this evening. Our program is sponsored by the Dobbin House Tavern and Restaurant, a longtime sponsor of both digital programs and live programs. So thank you, Dobbin House. And thank you to you, our viewers, who have been supporting us through the pandemic with your donations and your viewerships. We have some programs that have gone over 100,000 viewers, and I'm delighted to be able to share that news with you. Tonight's program is going to be about Gettysburg's airport and its work in flight training during World War II. Our speaker is John Banaszewski. John is a 20-year veteran as a licensed battlefield guide here in Gettysburg. For over 35 years, John has been working full-time at NASA, but he was a weekend guide at the National Battlefield Park here. A few years ago, John retired from NASA and moved here to become a full-time guide. He is obviously an expert on the Civil War battlefield, but he has developed an interest in World War II. So I'd like to start by asking John to tell us about where his passion for World War II came from. John, I'm going to turn it over to you, my friend.
Well, I've loved history ever since I was a kid. And I grew up in Erie, Pennsylvania, which has some historical interest because in the War of 1812, the American fleet that won the Battle of Lake Erie was built in Erie. And
Which is
so
your home?
that's my hometown. And so I've always loved history. And my dad and my uncle both served in World War II. So my initial interest in history was actually naval history, largely because of where I grew up. And when I was a teenager, I read every book I could find about the U.S. Navy in World War II. But then my interest then spread to World War II more globally, because my father was part of the D-Day invasion force on June 6, 1944. He was a medical technician. His job was to basically give first aid to wounded soldiers. And he was badly injured on June 6th. He says he remembers a flashing light and waking up the next day in a hospital in England. And so my dad served in World War II at Omaha Beach. An uncle was a bombardier in a B-17. And my uncle wrote a diary. My uncle flew over my dad on June 6th. So sometimes his B-17 passes over the boat where my dad is on June 6, 1944. And when I was a kid, there was all sorts of TV shows based on World War II, so I've always loved history in general, but World War II in particular. And a lot of that because of my family. My dad was a medical corpsman, my uncle a bombardier. My best friend's father fought at Guadalcanal. So they didn't talk about the war at all, but I knew of their history of the war. So as I became older, I want to find out more about what did they actually do. And there's some really interesting stories behind my dad and my uncle. And so it's kind of why I got interested in World War II. So I love history in general. I'm a specialist in Gettysburg, but also a big fan of World War II history. This is John Banaszewski. I'm a licensed battlefield guide here at Gettysburg. And I'm sure that you and I have many times visited Oak Hill, where the Peace Light Monument is located, because of the beautiful view. From here, I can see the entire Day One battlefield, and off to the right, I've marked where the McPherson barn can be seen. To the left of the tree in the center, 4 miles away, you can see the Round Top Hills. Off to the left, I've marked the cemetery. The trees against the sky are on Cemetery Hill. Just to the right of Cemetery Hill, I marked Gettysburg College. So a beautiful view, offers a great view of the battlefield. But if you look to the left, the area just in front of Gettysburg College, this is a view you would have got in July 1938, the year they dedicate the Peace Light Monument. And every veteran of the Civil War was invited to come to that dedication. So I marked some landmarks on the photo there. You can see the old dorm building, and off to the left you see Carlisle Road. This is an aerial view of the encampment. 2,000 veterans attend. Within 1/4 of all living veterans came to this event, and the crowd at the event would number 250,000 people. But among those 250,000 people, I estimate there are probably 15,000 veterans of World War I. Just 20 years earlier, 1918, thousands of the people in the audience would have been in trenches in France fighting in World War I. Now, 1938, there's a possibility of another world war. A lot of people in the United States believe that World War I was a mistake. The last thing the United States should do is get involved in another world war. Because if you think of the events occurring around this time, 2 years earlier, Benito Mussolini and Adolf Hitler signed an agreement, the Axis Pact. And Hitler's pouring tens of billions of dollars into rebuilding the German military. And a year earlier, 1937, Italy will invade Ethiopia, Japan will invade China, and Germany will now annex the nation of Austria, and has its sights set on Czechoslovakia. At this point, the United States Army has an army smaller than the nation of Portugal. We have the 19th biggest army in the entire world. And so Franklin Roosevelt is trying to get the country ready, knowing a lot of people are opposed to American involvement in the war. So during his speech, he doesn't talk much about current events. But in 1938, the year of the dedication, he'll put his name on a law passed by Congress to establish the Civilian Aeronautics Act of 1938, which authorizes civilian pilot training. Because in Italy and Germany, thousands of students, hundreds of colleges, are training people to be pilots for an upcoming war. So you now have a law passed in 1938, initially starting with 20,000 students at 9 schools. Over the next several years, more than 1,100 educational institutions will participate in this particular program. And so if you were here in 1938, you might have been standing at the Gettysburg Airport. And so the field immediately south of the Peace Monument was an airfield in the 1920s and the 1940s. So here's a photo of the airport. This may surprise you to know that that field that is now part of the national park was a very active airport in the 1920s, 30s, and 1940s. About the only thing you can find at the airport today is the foundation of the ticket booth. So the white building on the left I'm pointing to is a ticket booth, and on the right, a fellow guide of mine, Richard Core, is standing on a concrete block, which is all that we know exists of the Gettysburg Airport. Now, where is this located? So if you go to the bottom right, this is a photo from Google Earth. At the bottom, I show Route 30. So if you're at General Lee's headquarters building and heading west, the first traffic signal you come to is Reynolds Avenue, and if you turn right, you soon pass over the railroad cut. And the photo at the top left is taken from the railroad cut. Now, I've looked at a small portion of the photo, so that's why the resolution is very poor. If you keep going, you come to a T-shaped intersection. If you make a left-hand turn, this block of concrete is located where the arrow is. So the building that says Gettysburg Airport was very close to this T-shaped intersection. I believe that's the hangar for the airplanes. And on our left are 2 employees of the Gettysburg Flying Service. There's a landmark visible in both of these photos, which I marked. On Oak Ridge, there's an observation tower, which originally was 60 feet tall. Today, it's only 15 feet tall. As you can see, these 2 photos were taken roughly from the same area. And so that's a view of Gettysburg Airport as it looked during World War II. Now, World War I is a big reason why there's an airport in Gettysburg during World War II. And so, as you realize, the United States enters World War I very late in the war, April of 1917. and the United States Army is poorly equipped to fight a war. It possesses very few weapons, and the thing it lacks is airplanes. So if you read about American aviators in World War I, they are flying mostly French airplanes. But the United States Army Air Corps does have training planes, the most common called the Jenny biplane, built by the Curtiss Aeroplane Company in Hammondsport, New York. During World War I, the United States government will procure 5,500 two-seat trainers. And so 18 months later, the war is over. The United States will demobilize. There's now thousands of airplanes lying around and thousands of unemployed pilots. And the government will put these planes for sale for $300. Now that's in 1920s money. So to help you get a better idea, if you want to buy a 2006 Toyota Camry with 172,000 miles on it, that will cost you more than to buy an airplane in the 1920s. So your kids who work at McDonald's could probably afford to buy an airplane in the 1920s. So the combination of all these pilots and all these planes, you're now going to have an era of the 1920s called the barnstorming era. So all these pilots are going to try to fly around the country, and oftentimes they'll visit a farmer who has a field where they could use it as a landing strip. They're going to put on air shows. They're going to do crazy things. They're going to do spins, dives, loop-de-loops, barrels, very low altitude flying. They will actually play tennis on the airplane while it's flying at one of these air shows. So 1920s air shows are an extremely popular form of entertainment in the United States of America. And so in August of 1927, according to the Gettysburg Times, Gettysburg is now going to get an airport, which is going to be built on the land just south of the Peace Light Monument. So here's a headline from the Gettysburg Times, August 16, 1927, announcing the imminent opening of the Gettysburg Airport. And so who is behind the Gettysburg Airport? Built by a man named Henry Berliner, who in 1926 is going to buy land from a family known as the Forneys. Because during the battle itself, the land was owned by the Forney family. And so he's going to construct a ticket booth and a hangar for 4 airplanes. So this is a photo similar to one you saw earlier that shows the hangar. And this is at the intersection of Reynolds Avenue. To our left is Buford Avenue. To the right is Doubleday Avenue. And you can see the Peace Light in the distance. So what's Mr. Berliner going to do with this airport? He's going to offer tours of the battlefield. And so for the price of $3, which in today's money is roughly $45, you get a 15-minute tour in an airplane. You'll fly south along Seminary Ridge to see the Confederate position. You'll then head toward the Round Tops, fly north along the Union Fishhook on Cemetery Ridge, and land safely 15 minutes later back at the Gettysburg Airport, all for the price of only $3. So it's actually the second best way to visit the Gettysburg battlefield in the 1920s. The best way, of course, is to hire a licensed battlefield guide who gives you a tour in your car. You can also get flight training from Mr. Berliner, and he also is going to offer passenger service between D.C., Baltimore, and Philadelphia. But a big source of revenue is air shows. So I've blown up a portion of the advertisement that you saw in the paper, announcing that there's going to be an air show on the 27th and 20th of August to inaugurate the opening of the airport. And so here's a photo I found. You can find lots of photos of the barnstorm era. I have no idea where this was taken, but you can see the types of things that the pilots would do to entertain people at the air shows. And so almost on a monthly basis, they don't do it in the winter, but once a month there's an air show at the Gettysburg Airport in the late 1920s. And according to one account, they actually will do simulated bomb drops, dropping 50-pound bags of flour on targets on ground to simulate bombing. And the land was bought by the Forney family. So there's a young man whose name is George. As a teenage boy, he lives in the buildings that you see in the upper right. Now, the Forney farm existed at the time of the battle, but in 1938, when they built the Peace Light Monument, the National Park Service decided to not restore the barn, it was torn down. So the photo you can see that I'm pointing to, the cursor was taken from the observation tower. To the right is the farmhouse. And today you can see a depression in the ground where the house was located. To the left is the barn. And so the photo I'm now pointing to is taken on Buford Avenue, looking north. And just behind the barn would be the Mummersburg Road. So this young man, whose nickname was Peck, will now become a stunt pilot. So now the 1920s, young Peck Forney is flying in airplanes and entertaining the crowd. This is a story I found in the Gettysburg newspaper about a show done on October 21st, 1929. Talks about the events they had: air races, landings with the engine off, parachute drops. The article talks about the winners of the air race, and the reporters seem to be really impressed by a fellow named Thunderbolt Knight, who gets his plane up to an altitude of 300 feet, jumps out of the plane, deploys his parachute, and then after flying a few hundred feet, cuts his parachute loose, free falls again, and then deploys a second parachute. Reporters evidently very thrilled by a young man named Paul Charles. He talks about the wingovers, nosedives, and all the acrobatics that he did in his plane. This is a story October 21st, 1929. But what happens 1 week later? The value of your stock will plummet 25% in 2 days. You now have the stock market crash. You now have the Great Depression. People are probably not going to be inclined or have the ability to pay money to attend air shows. And so this is a story I found from 1932 that does say there will be an air show at the airport the following Sunday. As you can see, there's now a new owner to the airport, a man named Ed Hoche. According to the article, there's not been an air show for quite a few years, and they're hoping to revive interest in general aviation by this air show in 1932. But 1935, a tragedy will strike. Young George Forney is killed in a crash. He's participating in a show in Montoursville, Pennsylvania, which is about 80 miles north of Harrisburg, right on the Susquehanna River. And according to the newspaper stories, his plane is 50 feet up. For some reason, a crash, and young George Forney is burned to death in the crash plane. At the time, George was the manager of the Gettysburg Airport. So it seems like after this crash, that'll be the end to the air shows at the Gettysburg Airport. But the Gettysburg Airport will still exist in the 1930s, because now the owner will get a contract to help establish the first transcontinental airmail service. So this is a photo of the airmail plane that they used, and they operated, well, they had mail delivery pickup at the Gettysburg Airport. So according to the newspaper story, the service initiates between Philadelphia and Pittsburgh, and ultimately be 28 stations along the way. And so what they'll do is they'll put up a couple of poles with a rope strung between them. Attached to the rope is a bag of mail. Now a plane will fly over and deploy a hook, much like the hooks on aircraft carrier planes. And the hook will grab onto the rope, and then as the pilot continues flying, the other crewmen will pull the rope into the plane and secure the bag of mail. Now, a week ago, I talked to a man who lives in Gettysburg. He's 90 years old today. He said he and his buddies used to go there sometimes on bikes and make bets on whether or not the guy would hook the mail bag on his first try. He said never once did they fail to hook the bag of mail on the first try. So Gettysburg Airport, fairly dormant, I believe, in the 1930s, but you do have the airmail delivery. But that service will end in 1941. But what happens in 1941, Japan will attack Pearl Harbor. Germany will declare war on the United States of America. And now the United States of America is once again involved in a world war. So this is now when the Civil Aeronautics Act of 1938 is going to come into play here at Gettysburg. And a man named Richard Bircher will now win a contract with Temple University to teach students as part of the civilian pilot training program. Now, he himself was an interesting fellow, served in World War I as a Marine, became a pilot in the 1920s. 1942, actually owned an airport in North Philadelphia. But once Germany starts attacking American shipping along the coast, the government imposes a no-fly zone along the entire Atlantic coast. If you're a civilian, you cannot fly a plane unless you're 125 miles inland. So he's not able to use his own airport for the civilian pilot training program. But if he goes 140 miles west, he now finds a place where you have an airport here at Gettysburg. So in 1942, Richard Birch will now procure land to build a new airport on the same location as the previous airport. According to newspaper stories, he'll have two runways, a half-mile long, another one 1,900 feet long, receive a license from the Civilian Aeronautics Administration. He's going to make improvements include adding lighting to the Oak Ridge Observation Tower. So his students are from Temple University. Where is he going to house them? So he has to find a place for these young men to sleep and get their classroom training. He now is going to use a hotel located 2 miles south of Gettysburg, near the Peach Orchard, a hotel called the Mead Inn. So these Temple University students are now getting their classroom training at the Mead Inn. And now they get 35 hours of flight training done at the airport. The requirement by the government is you must have one plane for every 10 students. So that means that there's now roughly 8 or 10 airplanes operating out of this Gettysburg Airport, most popular being the Tandem Piper Club, of which 20,000 were built during World War II. And so eventually, during the war, the civil pilot training program will morph into what's called the War Training Service. And now Gettysburg College will win a contract to participate in the War Training Service. Now, this is the Oak Ridge Tower, which when built was 60 feet tall. And during this period, there is a light on the tower. And unfortunately, I've never been able to find a photo that shows the light. There are some interesting photos of the tower taken over time. In the 1950s, you would have seen a museum and souvenir stand across the street from that observation tower. But in 1960, the top 3/4 of the tower were removed because of problems with the tower. The present elevation now only 15 feet. But during World War II, this is a navigation aid to help you find the Gettysburg Airport. And if you're interested as where was the Mead Inn, you're probably familiar with the Peach Orchard. Now, this is a headline from the paper that talks about Temple University leasing the hotel. And here's a photo of the hotel as it looked in the 1930s and 1940s. It was a building where you had the office, a restaurant where you could get breakfast. That's probably where the owners lived. There's 18 small cottages where you can stay. And so if you want to find the Mead Inn, it's just south of the Peach Orchard on the west side of the Emmitsburg Road. So at the bottom right, this is a photo using Google Earth. So I've showed the Peach Orchard, the square you see marked by the red arrow. I've marked the Longstreet Tower. And now I show where the Mead Inn was located. So if you're familiar with the battlefield, the Rose Farm, the entrance is right there. The Mead Inn was directly across the street from the entrance to the Rose Farm. There's a photo of the Mead Inn taken from the Longstreet Tower. And so that's where the Temple University students would stay. And late in the war, the building is used as a map-making facility. There's about 4 people who originally worked for the Forestry Service. Their job is to now make maps of the Japanese-held islands of the Japanese homeland. And I believe the navigator of the Enola Gay used a map made in this building to drop the nuclear bomb on Hiroshima. But that's a different story. So now Gettysburg College will now participate in this new training program. And I found an article written by someone named Julia Grover, a student at the college. So if you're interested to find more about the program, it's the Gettysburg Historical Journal, Volume 3, Article 8. It's about a 25-page document describing what it's like at Gettysburg College and these students. So I borrowed a few of the points from this article that Julia Grover wrote, but first I'd like to show you a photo of the people employed by Mr. Bircher to train the students at Gettysburg College. So he's got 15 instructors to provide flight training, and behind the 15 instructors, you can see the hangar that was built for the airport in the 1940s. The hangar could house 10 airplanes. And this is an article from September of 1943. As you can see, the college students are being welcomed back to the college, but now you're going to have 550 cadets participate in the program. According to the article I cited earlier, World War II is very tough on colleges. Young men are now volunteering to serve in the Army or Navy, and many are now being drafted, so enrollment in Gettysburg College of male students will drop from 500 to 100 students in the first 2 years of the war. And so how much tuition is Gettysburg College losing because of the war? But now in March of 1943, the first of 3 installments of young cadets arrives at Gettysburg College. 550 members of the 55th College Training Detachment Army Aircrew, which is now known as the War Training Service. So in total, there'll be 3 installments of these students, roughly 550 each, a total of 1,659. The program at large lasts from March of 1943 to May of 1944. The college is going to provide the living facilities. So because the fraternity houses are empty, most of these young cadets are now housed in fraternity houses. And the college is going to provide education to these young students. And technically, Gettysburg College is now a military base in the 1940s when this program is now in effect. So the flagpole at Gettysburg College cannot be used because, according to Army regulations, only one flag can fly at an Army base. It must fly in front of the headquarters building. Now, the emphasis is very much on academics, and as you can see, there's much less emphasis on pilot training. The Temple University students got 35 hours of flight training. These students only get 10 hours. Because when you think of aircraft, when you think of pilots, probably often think of fighter pilots, but also think of bombers. So if you look at a B-17 crew, you have 2 pilots, a pilot, the co-pilot, but you have specialists, a bombardier, a navigator, and a radio operator. So what type of education do you need to know if you're going to be a bombardier? Well, you ought to know about geography. You're going to drop bombs at a target 5 miles below. You got to know what happens with the wind and how the effect of the wind on the bombs. So you need to be trained in physics and mathematics. If you're a navigator, it's also be very wise to be knowledgeable about geography and physics. And if you're a radio operator, an education of physics is very useful. So the training program now is now on training the entire air crews, not so much the pilots. And eventually 1,659 students will go through the program in roughly a year and a half. But in January 1944, the Congress will decide to discontinue the program. And Gettysburg College and 12 other colleges in Pennsylvania get a notice. The program will be discontinued once the current batch of students will be finished with their education. So you actually find testimony from Mr. Bircher testifying to Congress that the program should be continued. He's advocating continue the program after the war because he would say to Congress, if America has a huge body of trained pilots, no one will ever interfere with us in the future. As a measure of national security, even post-war, you should continue the program. But he'll be unsuccessful. The program will be eventually ended. And so Gettysburg College will now have to lay off, Mr. Birch will have to lay off the instructors that he has employed. Now, he's interviewed by the papers. He says he's going to keep the airport going. But in March 1947, March 8th, a tragedy is going to strike Gettysburg Airport. And so this is March of 1947. According to his newspaper story, a cargo plane, probably a C-47, lands carrying a load of baby chicks. There are 6,000 baby chicks aboard this plane. A local Adams County farmer is going to purchase 1,800 of these chicks. The pilot now decides to head to his next destination to drop off more chicks, which is Winchester, Virginia. According to the newspaper story, Mr. Birch is going to argue with the pilot to convince him it's too dangerous to take off because there's snow on the ground, and this airplane is not equipped with skis. If you see pictures or video of airplanes in Alaska, those planes often use skis instead of wheels for the landing gear. So Mr. Birch has said he tried to convince the pilot because he doesn't have skis, he won't get enough airspeed to take off from the airport runway, which is covered with snow. And in fact, that will happen. The man will attempt to take off, and near the end of the runway, he realizes he's not going to get up. He's going to try to then brake, but his plane will flip over at the end of the runway. The pilot is not injured, the plane is damaged, doesn't catch fire. But what are you going to do with all these baby chicks? And so Mr. Birch agrees that the chicks can be kept in the hangar building, but that night a fire destroys the hangar and 8 of the airplanes that are in the hangar. According to the newspaper story, there's $82,000 of damage done because of the fire. The hangar is destroyed, and here's a photo of the hangar. And so Mr. Bircher said his building was insured, but Mr. Birch is also frustrated with the regulation of airports now being mandated by the United States Congress. You can see he's giving testimony where he's complaining that the government's making it impossible for people like him to run airports because of all this bureaucratic red tape. So less than about a year after the airport will burn, 66 acres of land is sold to the National Park Service. So if you saw the picture of the tower, the land that runs along that road, Doubleday Avenue, is purchased by the National Park Service in May of 1948. And I believe that is the end of the operation of the Gettysburg Airport. I did find an article from July 1981 that says some of the land was still owned by the airport, but now it's purchased by a turf farmer, and who actually still has a turf farm out on the Mummasburg Road. So 1981, land that was part of the airport is now purchased and now turned into a turf farm. And so when you do research, sometimes you find stuff you weren't looking for. And I was talking to a fellow guide of mine in the guide waiting room, and he says, "Hey, there's a picture of an airplane on that field." I looked at the picture. It's dated September 20th, 1925, 2 years before the airport was opened. And the picture's taken on the land owned by the Forney Farm. So in this picture, I've highlighted the airplane sitting on the ground. To the left, you can see the observation tower. What you might find interesting are the costumes of the people in the photo. So in 1925, at the national meeting of the Ku Klux Klan, 10,000 Klan's members will come to Gettysburg for their national convention. Here's a story from the local paper that talks about the meeting of the 10,000 members of the Ku Klux Klan, September 20th, 1925. And so this is the earliest photo I've found of an airplane on the land that would then become the Gettysburg Airport. One thing I've tried to find out, and I've never found out conclusively, where were the runways? So the only remnant we can find of the airport is that block of concrete, which is located down where the cursor is pointing. But if you use the application called Google Earth, it can actually be very helpful to do historical research. In the upper right, I have a picture of the angle. Now, probably you've all heard of the angle. That's made famous by the Pickett's Charge attack. The road on the right of the picture is Hancock Avenue. And the tree you see in the corner is the tree at the 90-degree bend in the stone wall. And I'm pointing to the California Regiment Monument. But you can see that the grass is a different color where you see the dashed lines. So if you ever use Google Earth, it uses imagery, much of which is collected by a satellite called Landsat. And I worked for 35 years for NASA. I worked on the Landsat project, so I'm somewhat familiar with the satellite. What you actually see is the remnants of the Park Road as they existed in 1895. So when Gettysburg became a national park, the road was now diverted. But you can still see the actual path of the road built when the traffic was by horse-drawn carriages. So you can see the different color because at one time there was a paved road, but today it's all grass. So using Google, sometimes you can find features that existed in the past because you can filter the pictures to get different types of light. Now, the only photo I found that might be the runway is the one on the bottom right. So I thought at one time that gray line that goes from right to left could have been a runway. According to one newspaper story, there were two runways, which are half mile and 1,960 feet. And so if you look at Google Earth today, and this is the area where the airport was, if you try to fit a half-mile runway into the airport, it won't fit if you go north to south. But I later found a story that says the runway was 2,200 feet and not a half mile. And so if you look at this photo, you can actually see there's a color variation. Where I'm pointing with the cursor, you see there's a yellow strip. So I believe the yellow strip indicates where the runway was located during the period where this was the airport. Now, if you actually walk this ground, there today is a stream. There's actually a running water, but it forms a perfectly straight line for the entire length of the field. So I believe the north-south runway was right on this area, which makes sense because the ticket booth was there. So you could buy a ticket and go to the end of the runway. So I believe this was the north-south runway. According to newspaper stories, there were two runways, at least, possibly a third. So if you look at this part of the photo, you can see where the grass looks yellow compared to green, because this may have been the location of the other runway. So anyway, this is my best guess as to location of where the runways were during World War II. So anyway, that's the story of the Gettysburg Airport, the role it played in World War II. And there's lots of things about Gettysburg which have a connection to World War II. And one time, the Armory building on West Confederate Avenue housed German prisoners of war who built a POW camp located along the Emmitsburg Road. Just south of the Armory building is the McMillan Woods, which was a civilian conservation corps camp in World War II. It later housed a psychological warfare training group that was deployed to Europe in 1944 after the D-Day invasion. I mentioned about the Mead Inn, how it was used as a mapping facility in World War II. Then you had the German POW camp located on the Emmitsburg Road. So anyway, there's a lot of World War II sites of interest on the Gettysburg battlefield. But hopefully today you'll know a little bit more about the airport itself and the role that that particular airport played, especially in World War II. So once again, it's not so much pilot training as a screening program. The students who seem to be the most suited to be pilots will get their training at a flight school. So the operation at Gettysburg was mostly to weed out those people who were not suited to be pilots, but use their skills in other areas such as bombardiers, navigators, or radio operators. So I hope you found this talk interesting, and this is the role of Gettysburg during World War II.
Thank you, John, for sharing those interesting stories and a new perspective on our own area history. I'm particularly impressed by your ability to combine intensive research, digging in the archives, with modern technology, showing us on Google Earth where some of these places might have been. Let me suggest to our viewers, if you have questions, John is willing to field questions on the World War II sites and some of his research. I have listed his email address here. It's john@historyandleadership.com. John is also available, of course, as a licensed battlefield guide. He can give you the battlefield tour, and also point out the World War II sites. I believe this summer that Gettysburg Tour Company will start up again the weekend tours of the World War II sites. So please come back to Gettysburg, support the Historical Society, and we hope to keep sharing stories with you. Thank you.